Jacob in Egypt. This is a short chapter that really deals mostly with practical matters. And also, we need to understand here how the Israelites became established in Egypt. Chapter 47, verse 1. Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they're in the land of Goshen. He took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation? So they said to Pharaoh, Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They said to Pharaoh, We have come to sojourn in the land, for there's no pasture for your servants' flocks. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Joseph had told his brothers to say all that, and that they were shepherds and that their ancestors were shepherds. Now, according to the Egyptians, occupations were hereditary, which meant there's no possibility of a change to their mode of life. They would assume that these herdsmen would stay in the same occupation and not try to move into other occupations. In other words, they won't be a threat. In verse 4, their request to live in the land actually meant to sojourn, to live only temporarily in the land. Perhaps they did not know that they were to stay in Egypt for 400 years. Jacob knew it, as was prophesied to Abraham, or they simply chose not to believe it. They also asked to be allowed to live in the land of Goshen, because there was no longer any pasture land in Canaan. Verse 5. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. Pharaoh agrees to let them live in Goshen. He speaks to Joseph instead of directly to the 5 brothers. This is court protocol at that time, that he wouldn't be addressing them together, just as a group of men standing there he never met before. But he speaks to his second in command, or his first in command under him, Joseph. Now, he also directs Joseph to pick out the most expert cattlemen among his family to tend his livestock, because he knows that these herdsmen have a better knowledge of livestock than do the Egyptians. Verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, How many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, The years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. Nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. The 5 brothers stepped back, actually probably left the room, to address, so that Pharaoh could address their father separately. And then Jacob blesses Pharaoh, which is the opposite of what would generally be done, because usually it'd be Pharaoh blessing his servants and so forth. Pharaoh then asked, How old are you? The Egyptians had great respect for elders. You can read on the page here. Ancient records show that they did not live as long as did the Hebrews. Jacob must have been showing his age, and so Pharaoh wonders just how old he is. Imagine what we would think if we met someone who was 130 years old. I'm sure he would look his age, and we would really be wondering, how old are you? Jacob answers that he's 130 years old and has had a lot of trouble during his life. I'm sure that he didn't think to mention that his troubles in life are actually his own fault. I'm sure he left that out of this thing. He also says that his father and grandfather lived much longer than he had. Wow. His great age in the eyes of Pharaoh gave him dignity in this palace, and Pharaoh is in awe of him. Okay, then Jacob blesses Pharaoh again, further reflecting that he was allowed to bless the king due to his age. Wow. He is granted great honor before Pharaoh due to his age. Verse Verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones. We learn here that Goshen had the best agricultural land, especially for livestock, in all of Egypt. The land of Ramesses. It's a later explanation added by Moses. Remember, he's the writer of this book, of where Goshen was, since this was long before Pharaoh Ramses would be born. At that time, if there was a town there, it would have been a small village, and it wouldn't have had the name Ramses. Now, Joseph sees to it also that all his family had sufficient food for their needs. Verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." The scene now shifts to the Egyptians' condition, that they had spent all their money to purchase their grain back from Joseph. Joseph transfers all of this money into Pharaoh's accounts, enriching him, that is, Pharaoh, greatly. The famine still grips the land, so that the Egyptian people now have to beg for food, since they have no more money. Verse 16. Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, and the flocks, and the herds, and the donkeys. And he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We'll not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed, that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. So let's examine these first two verses a little closer. Joseph says they can swap their livestock for more grain. Pharaoh's getting richer and richer. And notice here something we don't want to get past us. Horses are mentioned here. That indicates strongly that Hyksos kings were on the throne in Egypt at this time, since they're believed to have introduced horses into Egypt. Horses were not in Egypt when Abraham went there. Okay, let's look at the second part of that passage. The Egyptian people have again run out of grain and have nothing left to trade except themselves and their land. So Joseph agrees to take their land and make them serfs under Pharaoh in trade for more grain. Wow, Pharaoh is getting exceedingly rich. I'm sure he thinks Joseph is a wonder boy, because it's making him a billionaire of that time. Some people argue that Joseph's acts here generated hate against him and his family among the Egyptian people. However, he did not personally profit from any of this, since everything went to Pharaoh. The people of Egypt, as separate from the Hebrews, knew where the money and them and their land and everything else was going. It was going to Pharaoh. It wasn't going into Joseph's pocket. However, some say that 400 years later, the Egyptians had remembered the treatment they had at Joseph's hand, and they were now going to take it out on the Israelites by forcing them into slavery and getting them to go build pyramids and such. Now, Joseph shows wisdom here. He also moved the population, which had been scattered all over Egypt and along the river, of course, so that they would have easy access to the food they needed. He put them in the grain cities, and so distribution would have been far easier that way. Verse 22. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the field, and food for you and for those of your households, as well as food for your little ones. So they said, You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Okay, we see here that the religious rulers, the priests, were exempt from all of this taking of land and serfdom and so forth, since they were already supported by the government. They were basically government bureaucrats, and for centuries, if not millennia, the priests had great power in Egypt. Now, Joseph instructs the Egyptians to use part of their grain allotment to sow their fields in preparation for the end of the famine coming the next year. The Egyptian people were allowed to continue to live on their former land and to prepare to begin farming it, since the famine would be soon over. They would return 20% of the grain produced to Pharaoh, that's the government, and keep the rest. They thanked Joseph for saving their lives and agree to continue to be Pharaoh's servants. We're told that this 20% tax began with Joseph and lasted at least until the time of the writer, Moses, and the priests continued to be exempt from this tax. Verse 27. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. Moses adds here that the Israelites acquired property and multiplied greatly over time. And notice this, they were allowed to buy property while the Egyptian people couldn't do that. We hear now that Jacob lived for another 17 years in Egypt, which made him 147 years old when he died. He was the third and last patriarch of the Israelites, along with his father Isaac and grandfather Abraham. Now, this time also gave Jacob a lot of time in which to reconnect with Joseph and his sons. I'm sure they did that as much as possible. Verse 29. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I'll do as you've said. He said, Swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. Israel, Jacob, knows he doesn't have long to live and wants to make sure that he doesn't get buried in Egypt. He has a very strong yearning to be buried with the other members of his family at Machpelah. And so he makes Joseph promise to bury him there. Now, who is buried at Machpelah? We have Abraham and Sarah. We have Isaac and Rebekah. And we also have Leah there. Rachel's not there. She is buried at Bethlehem. Joseph promises to his father Jacob here, using this custom of placing his hand under Israel's thigh, which was a very solemn ritual. It's one that was used apparently all across the Middle East at that time. Jacob, as Israel now, then leaned back on his bed, happy now that he has Joseph's promise that he's going to be buried at Machpelah, and he worships God. What we see here is a man of faith who is at peace with his approaching death. What we have here with Israel is an illustration showing that the hope of Old Testament believers was an earthly hope, literally, that they would inherit the promised land at the end of the age. Therefore, he wants to be raised from the dead there. The hope of New Testament believers is different. We're looking forward to the New Jerusalem to be with our Lord Jesus Christ and not the physical promised land on earth. That doesn't mean we won't be able to go to earth. Most likely we will, but the land there is specifically promised forever to Israel.